Hey, Cohort 17, it's Derek, and I'm here to share with you my riveting discoveries from my project. I'm going to try to keep it brief and just give you some of the salient points. But since we don't really have time for or a means by which to discuss it, you'll just have to take my word for it, even though my word is probably wrong. So basically, I focused my project on student retention in distance education. Based on this article by Ormond Simpson, who observed a fairly remarkable piece of data, namely that full-time students enrolled in conventional institutions had an extremely high graduation rate as opposed to distance institutions. And so the author labeled this an observable deficit, essentially. And so what I did is I wanted to grab onto some data from iPads in my region and focus in on institutions that provide graduate offerings, because that's the constituency and the world that I live in, and see if in some way, shape, or form this trend would bear out. So essentially what I found as I gathered the data is that, and just to specify, I focus primarily on institutions' part-time retention rates, because the article from the author really pointed out that a focus on graduation rates, while interesting, is not essentially helpful in a predictive sense, because really what you want to know is where you're losing those students. So it's more important to look at the retention rates to kind of see where you're losing these students. So I focus specifically in on part-time retention rates, as a means just to discover if primarily the effect was on this particular population, namely part-time students. And I focused even more particularly on those who are exclusively enrolled in distance education courses. And while I can't necessarily take you through all my data, I'll kind of scroll down to my tables here at the very end. And I apologize. For some reason, I can't get the my stupid Microsoft Word to increase to 150%, so you can actually see what I'm looking at. But there you go. Thanks, technology. You're always helpful to me. So essentially, what I found was that when you categorize the institutions by the size of their student population that's enrolled exclusively in distance education courses, there is in fact a significant difference in retention rates when those rates are categorized into low, medium, and high. And so while that is somewhat helpful, namely that if you have a smaller institution, you tend to have a better chance of having a higher part-time retention rate with students enrolled exclusively in distance education courses, whereas if you have a population of students over 400 who are exclusively enrolled in distance education, it tends to affect your part-time retention rate negatively, which isn't really that surprising, but there you go. That's something that I found. There was a significant impact on institutions that have more than 400 students enrolled exclusively in distance education courses negatively. However, what I found even more interesting based on all this is that if you actually run the numbers in a correlation analysis with the data that is not categorical but rather continuous, I found that there was no significant difference. In other words, whether or not you had students, a greater number of students enrolled exclusively in distance education courses, did not have a significant effect, or I shouldn't say effect, did not have a significant relationship to your part-time retention rate. So in some ways, I found then that while while interesting to observe the graduation rate being so extremely low, it doesn't necessarily have an effect on the part-time retention rate of institutions. So unfortunately, then I couldn't really come up with any sort of predictive model. But then again, I may have missed a few things here and there with my data. So those are the conclusions I came to and the things that I looked at. Regardless of the validity of my statistical analysis, I do recommend that you read Simpson's article. It's fascinating. I think something that we should at least look into and gather some more data about. Look forward to seeing you all in class in a couple weeks.